April 15th, 1817. The east wing corridor of Ashworth Manor lay silent at 8 in the evening, wrapped in shadows that seemed to breathe with the weight of propriety and secrets. Clara Thornhill pressed her worn grey skirts against the polished wall, her calloused fingers trembling as they touched the doorframe she had dusted perhaps 1,000 times in her 3 years of service. The keyhole gaped before her like an invitation to damnation. A small circle of brass, worn smooth by decades of keys that locked and unlocked the private bathing chamber of the Duke of Ashworth. She had discovered its secret by accident 3 months prior while scrubbing the wainscoting, had noticed how the mechanism had loosened with age, creating a gap just wide enough to permit a sliver of vision into the marble chamber beyond. That first glimpse had been unintentional, a moment of unfortunate timing as she knelt to retrieve her brush, but what she had seen then had branded itself upon her mind with merciless clarity. Alexander Pembroke, the 6th Duke of Ashworth, stood alone in water that steamed gently in the candlelight, his dark hair wet against his neck, his shoulders bearing the tension of a man who carried the weight of ancient titles and modern loneliness. Clara knew she should flee, knew that what she did violated every code of decency that governed the chasm between a housemaid and a duke. Yet here she stood again, drawn by a compulsion that shamed her even as it consumed her. Through the narrow aperture she could see him now, his movements slow and weary as he shed his evening clothes, the candlelight painting golden shadows across skin she had no right to observe. The scent of lavender soap drifted through the gap, mingling with the humid warmth that emanated from the chamber, and Clara closed her eyes against the wave of longing that threatened to overwhelm her remaining sense. He was beautiful in his solitude, yes, but it was more than physical desire that drew her to this forbidden ritual. In these private moments, Alexander Pembroke was simply a man, stripped of the armor of ducal formality, his face unguarded in ways it never was when he moved through the manor's public spaces. She watched him sink into the copper tub with a sigh that spoke of exhaustion deeper than physical weariness, watched him rest his head against the curved rim as if the water might wash away burdens that titles and wealth could not ease. Clara's heart clenched with something dangerously close to tenderness, a feeling she had no right to harbor for a man who existed in a world as distant from hers as the stars. A floorboard creaked somewhere behind her, and Clara's blood turned to ice. Mrs. Langley's voice echoed from the servant's stair, calling instructions to another maid, and Clara pressed herself flat against the wall, her breath trapped in her chest. The housekeeper's footsteps approached, steady and purposeful, and Clara abandoned her post with silent desperation, slipping into the alcove that housed the linen cupboard just as Mrs. Langley's stern profile appeared at the corridor's end. Hidden among the lavender-scented sheets, Clara pressed a hand to her racing heart, and felt the full weight of her transgression settle upon her shoulders like a yoke she could neither carry nor set down. April 16th, 1817. The kitchen of Ashworth Manor stirred to life at 6 in the morning, the air already thick with the scent of baking bread and the sharp commands of cook directing her domain with military precision. Clara's hands moved through the familiar motions of scrubbing the copper pots, the rough bristles of the brush abrading skin already raw from years of service, her calloused fingers a testament to the grinding repetition of her station. She had barely slept, her mind returning again and again to the keyhole, to the sight of Alexander Pembroke in his private vulnerability, to the way his shoulders had carried such visible weariness. The guilt sat in her stomach like spoiled food, curdling with a shame that made her want to scrub her own skin as vigorously as she attacked the pots. Mary Colburn worked beside her at the washing table, her cheerful face animated with the gossip that sustained the servants through their endless labor, and she nudged Clara with a familiar elbow. "You are miles away this morning." she teased, her voice low enough to escape Cook's notice. Dreaming of some handsome footman, perhaps. Clara managed a weak smile and shook her head, unable to meet her friend's eyes, knowing that the truth of her transgression would horrify even Mary's generous spirit. Thomas Whitmore, the butler whose sharp eyes missed nothing that occurred within the manor's walls, passed through the kitchen with his customary air of superiority, his gaze falling upon Clara's work with evident disapproval. "These pots are still spotted," he announced coldly, his finger pointing to marks Clara could barely discern. "A housemaid who cannot manage basic duties is of questionable value to this household." Clara murmured an apology and bent to her task with renewed vigor, her cheeks burning with the familiar sting of his criticism, a reminder that she occupied the lowest rung of a hierarchy that stretched far above her reach. Through the open doorway that connected the kitchen to the main hall, she caught a glimpse of the Duke himself, passing with his steward, their heads bent together in discussion of estate matters that existed in a realm as foreign to her as distant continents. Alexander Pembroke moved with the unconscious grace of someone who had never questioned his right to occupy space, his dark coat perfectly tailored, his profile serious as he listened to reports of tenants and harvests, and matters of consequence. He did not glance toward the kitchen, did not acknowledge the invisible army of servants whose labor maintained the gracious facade of his existence, and Clara felt the familiar ache of her own insignificance settle over her like a heavy cloak. She was nothing to him, less than nothing, a ghost who moved through his house, leaving no impression beyond clean floors and polished silver. Mrs. Langley appeared in the doorway with her ever-present ledger, her stern face surveying the kitchen with the practiced eye of one who had maintained order in great houses for 30 years. "Clara," she called, her voice cutting through the kitchen's din, "you will attend to the east wing today. The chambers require thorough cleaning." Clara's heart lurched against her ribs, her hands stilling in the wash water as the assignment fell upon her like a sentence. The east wing meant the corridor, meant proximity to that door and that keyhole and the terrible temptation she had promised herself she would resist. She nodded her acceptance, not trusting her voice, and felt Mary's curious gaze upon her as Mrs. Langley departed. The morning stretched ahead with the weight of an impossible test, and Clara knew with sick certainty that her resolve was already crumbling. April 16th, 1817. The East Wing corridor stretched before Clara at 8 in the evening like a passage into temptation itself, the familiar silence broken only by the distant chiming of the manor's great clock marking the hour when Alexander Pembroke retreated to his private chambers. She had sworn to herself throughout the long day that she would not return to this place, had repeated the vow like a prayer as she scrubbed floors and polished silver and endured Thomas Whitmore's sharp criticisms, yet her feet had carried her here with the inevitability of water flowing downhill. The keyhole waited in its familiar place, that small circle of worn brass that had become the aperture through which her entire existence seemed to focus, and Clara knelt before it with trembling hands pressed against the doorframe as if seeking forgiveness from the wood itself. Through the gap she could see him already in the marble chamber, and something in his bearing tonight struck her with unexpected force. Alexander Pembroke moved with none of the grace she had observed before, his shoulders carrying a weight that seemed to bow his spine, his face marked by lines of exhaustion that aged him beyond his 32 years. He shed his evening clothes with mechanical movements, letting the fine fabric fall to the floor with uncharacteristic carelessness, and when he sank into the copper tub, the sigh that escaped him spoke of a weariness that no amount of hot water could ease. Clara watched as he rested his head against the tub's curved rim, his eyes closed, and she noticed for the first time a scar that marked his left shoulder, a pale line against his skin that suggested some past injury or perhaps a childhood accident. The detail seemed unbearably intimate, a small imperfection that made him somehow more real, less the distant figure of authority, and more a man who had lived and suffered and carried marks upon his body as she carried calluses upon her hands. Then he spoke aloud, his voice quiet but clear enough to carry through the gap, and Clara's breath caught in her throat. "The loneliness of command is a peculiar burden," he said to the empty air, his words measured as if he were addressing some invisible companion. "My brother understood it. He carried it better than I ever shall." Clara's heart contracted with unexpected pain as she heard the grief beneath the words, the reference to a brother spoken in past tense, suggesting a loss that still marked him. Alexander opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling, water dripping from his hair, and continued speaking as if the act of voicing his thoughts brought some small relief. "Everyone wants something from a duke," he said softly. "His title, his wealth, his influence, his name. No one asks what the man beneath the coronet might need or feel or long for in the dark hours when the mask becomes too heavy to bear." Clara pressed her hand against her mouth to stifle the sound that threatened to escape, her vision blurring with tears she had no right to shed for a man she had no right to watch. In that moment, her desire transformed into something far more dangerous than physical longing, became instead a fierce wish to reach through the barrier of wood and brass and class and offer him the comfort of being truly seen, not as the Duke of Ashworth, but as Alexander Pembroke, a man suffering isolation in rooms filled with luxury but empty of genuine connection. April 22nd, 1817. The drawing-room of Ashworth Manor at 3 in the afternoon seemed transformed by the presence of Lady Beatrice Somerset, whose arrival that morning had sent the household staff into a flurry of preparation and whose elegance now dominated the carefully appointed space like a hothouse orchid overshadowing wildflowers. Clara stood near the sideboard with silver tea service in hand, her worn grey dress and plain mob cap marking her as part of the invisible machinery that sustained such gatherings, and she watched with something like despair as Lady Beatrice arranged herself upon the settee in a gown of emerald silk that caught the light with every calculated movement. The widow was perhaps 28 years old, her beauty the polished sort that came from wealth and leisure, and the attentions of skilled ladies' maids, her dark hair dressed in the latest fashion, and a diamond necklace glittering at her throat with casual extravagance. Alexander Pembroke sat across from her in one of the wing chairs, his posture correct, but somehow distant, his responses to her animated conversation polite, yet lacking the warmth that would have encouraged genuine connection. Clara poured tea with steady hands despite the churning in her stomach, moving through the ritual of service while her entire being focused on the scene before her with painful intensity. Lady Beatrice spoke of London society and mutual acquaintances and the tedium of country life in a voice pitched to suggest sophisticated boredom, and Clara could see the performance beneath, the words, the way the widow angled her body to display her figure to advantage and touched Alexander's arm with practiced familiarity. This was a woman who belonged in his world, whose breeding and fortune and social graces made her the obvious choice for a duke seeking a suitable wife, and the contrast between Beatrice's polished elegance and Clara's rough hands and simple dress struck like a physical blow. As Clara retreated to refill the teapot from the kitchen, she passed the corridor where Lady Beatrice's maid stood gossiping with one of the footmen, and the words she overheard made her steps falter. "Her ladyship has set her cap for the Duke most decidedly," the maid was saying with satisfaction. "She told me this morning that she expects an offer before the month is out, and who could blame his grace for choosing such a perfect match?" Clara continued walking before they could notice her presence, The teapot clutched against her chest like armor, and when she reached the servants' hall, she found Mary waiting with concerned eyes that saw too much. "You look as if you've seen a ghost," Mary said softly, guiding Clara to sit upon the worn bench. Clara shook her head, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat, and felt the full weight of impossibility settle upon her shoulders like stones. Whatever foolish fantasy she had nurtured through those months at the keyhole, whatever connection she had imagined with a man who spoke his loneliness to empty air, it dissolved in the face of Lady Beatrice Somerset's diamond necklace and emerald silk. Mary squeezed her hand and said nothing, her silence more compassionate than any words could be, and Clara made a vow that this time she would keep. She would not return to that corridor or that keyhole or that dangerous glimpse into a world that could never include someone like her. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. April 23rd, 1817. Clara had meant to stay away from the East Wing corridor that evening at 8, had promised herself even as she scrubbed the scullery floors and prepared the vegetables for tomorrow's breakfast that she would honor the vow made in the servants' hall with Mary's compassionate hand upon her own, yet circumstance conspired against her resolution with the cruel precision of fate itself. Mrs. Langley had discovered a water stain on the corridor carpet outside the Duke's chambers, some careless spill from an earlier bath that required immediate attention lest it set permanently into the expensive weave, and Clara found herself dispatched with rags and vinegar solution to attend to the very spot she had sworn to avoid. She worked with trembling hands as the great clock chimed the hour, knowing that beyond the heavy door Alexander Pembroke would be entering, his private sanctuary for the nightly ritual she had observed for 3 months, and despite every rational thought, screaming that she should finish quickly and flee, her fingers seemed to move with deliberate slowness over the damp carpet. The stain lifted gradually beneath her ministrations, and when she had no more excuse to remain, she found herself kneeling there in the empty corridor with her cleaning supplies beside her and the keyhole waiting like a test of character she had already failed a dozen times before. Clara pressed her eye to the worn brass circle with a sense of helpless surrender, and what she saw through that aperture struck her with unexpected force. Alexander Pembroke stood beside the copper tub with his back to the door, still fully clothed in the evening attire he must have worn to dinner with Lady Beatrice. And even from this limited vantage, Clara could see the rigid tension in his shoulders and the agitated movements of his hands as he loosened his cravat with sharp, frustrated gestures. He shed his coat and waistcoat with none of his usual methodical care, letting the expensive garments fall to the marble floor as if they offended him. And when he finally spoke aloud, his voice carried an edge of barely controlled anger that made Clara's breath catch. "Tedious conversations with hollow people who speak in platitudes and care only for appearances," he said to the empty room, his words clipped and harsh. "An entire evening discussing nothing of substance with someone who sees only a title and a fortune, and performs her interest like an actress upon a stage." Clara watched as Alexander braced his hands against the edge of the tub and bowed his head, his frustration giving way to something that looked like weary resignation. "They tell me Lady Beatrice would make a perfect duchess," he continued more quietly, "and perhaps by society's measure she would. Yet I find myself suffocating in her presence as I suffocate in every drawing-room and ballroom where people perform their assigned roles without a single genuine moment passing between them." He straightened and began removing his shirt, and Clara saw his face in profile, the lines of exhaustion deepened by disappointment. "My brother used to say that the cage of nobility becomes bearable only if you find one person who sees past the gilded bars," Alexander said softly, "and I begin to understand what he meant. for I would trade every tedious, perfect match for a single conversation with someone real. Clara pulled back from the keyhole with tears streaming down her face, her heart aching with a hope she had no right to feel. The foolish, impossible notion that perhaps somewhere in this vast manor, filled with appropriate choice and suitable matches, a man suffocating behind gilded bars might find authenticity in the most unaffected of places, though she dared not imagine that place could include a housemaid with calloused hands kneeling in a corridor with vinegar solution soaking into her worn grey dress. April 28th, 1817. The library of Ashworth Manor at mid-morning was a sanctuary of leather and paper and spring sunlight filtering through tall windows, and Clara Thornhill moved through it with the careful reverence she always felt in this room, where the accumulated wisdom of generations lined the walls in orderly rows of Morocco bindings stamped with gold. She had been assigned to dust the shelves, a task that required her to climb the rolling ladder and attend to the higher volumes that accumulated cobwebs in their neglected positions, and she worked methodically with her cloth, while allowing herself the small, forbidden pleasure of reading the spine titles as she passed, her lips forming silent words like poetry and philosophy and travels in distant lands. Her worn grey dress was already smudged with dust, and her mob cap sat askew on her dark hair. But in this moment, with no one to observe her, she felt almost content, surrounded by books that represented worlds far beyond the narrow confines of her existence. She was perched on the ladder, examining a volume of Wordsworth, when the door opened without warning, and Clara's entire body went rigid, with the instinctive freeze of prey animals when predators appear, her hands clutching the shelf before her so tightly that her calloused fingers turned white. Alexander Pembroke entered his library with the casual assumption of ownership that marked every movement of the nobility, yet he paused just inside the doorway when he noticed her presence, and for the first time in the 3 months Clara had observed him through keyholes and caught glimpses of him in corridors, he truly looked at her. Not through her as masters looked through servants, not past her as if she were part of the furniture, but directly at her face with eyes that saw a human being rather than a function. Clara felt her breath stop in her lungs, felt the world narrow to the space between them, and the weight of his attention like a physical touch, and she could not have moved or spoken if her life depended upon it. He walked closer to where she stood, frozen on the ladder, and his voice when he spoke held a warmth that made her tremble. "You handle my books with great care," he said, his gaze moving from her face to her hands, still resting protectively on the volumes before her. "I have noticed how you never crack the spines or dog the pages, and just now I observed you reading the titles with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than mere cataloguing. What is your name?" Clara felt her voice catch in her throat, felt the full impossibility of this moment crashing over her. This man she had watched in his most private hours now standing close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his grey eyes. "Clara Thornhill, Your Grace," she managed to whisper, and hated how her voice shook with the words. He smiled slightly, a softening of his features that transformed his usually severe expression into something approaching kindness. "You were reading Wordsworth, Clara Thornhill," he observed, and there was curiosity in his tone rather than censure. "Do you enjoy poetry?" She nodded mutely, unable to form words, and watched as his smile deepened with what looked like unexpected pleasure before Mrs. Langley's voice from the corridor shattered the moment like glass. Clara practically fled down the ladder and past him with a stammered apology. But as she rushed from the library with her heart pounding and her hands shaking, she felt his eyes following her departure with an interest that changed everything, and she knew with terrible certainty that the invisible barrier between their worlds had just developed its first irreparable crack. April 28th, 1817. Clara had told herself as she moved through her afternoon duties that the morning encounter in the library meant nothing, that the Duke of Ashworth had merely been polite to a servant who happened to care for his books. Yet even as she scrubbed floors and carried linens and endured the suspicious scrutiny of Thomas Whitmore, who seemed to sense some disturbance in the household order, she felt the electric memory of Alexander Pembroke's grey eyes meeting hers with genuine recognition, rather than the blank indifference she had known all her life. When evening arrived and the great clock chimed 8, Clara found herself once again in the East Wing corridor, with cleaning supplies she did not need, and a trembling awareness that everything had changed irreversibly in the 10 hours since he had asked her name. She knelt before the keyhole, with her heart hammering so violently she feared it might be audible through the heavy door, and when she pressed her eye to the worn brass circle, the scene beyond struck her with paralyzing force, because Alexander Pembroke stood in his customary position beside the copper tub, removing his evening clothes with the same methodical care she had observed for 3 months. Yet something in his bearing suggested a heightened awareness that had not existed before. Clara watched as he shed his coat and loosened his cravat, watched the familiar ritual unfold with the lamplight casting golden shadows across the marble floor and steam rising from the bath water scented with lavender. But then Alexander paused in the act of unbuttoning his shirt and turned his head slightly toward the door, not looking directly at it, but tilting as if listening for some sound only he could detect. Clara's breath caught in her throat, and she went absolutely still, with her eye pressed to the keyhole and her hands braced against the wall, and in that suspended moment she saw his expression shift into something thoughtful and almost tender, a slight curve to his mouth that might have been a smile. He continued undressing, but his movements seemed deliberate now, conscious, as if he performed for an audience he acknowledged without naming, and when he finally stepped into the bath and settled back against the copper rim with water lapping at his shoulders, he spoke aloud in a voice so quiet Clara had to strain to hear the words. "I find these evening hours less lonely of late," he said to the empty room, "though perhaps I deceive myself in imagining a sympathetic presence where none exists. Yet I confess the notion brings me unexpected comfort in what has been a day of remarkable discoveries." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, because she understood with shattering clarity that he knew, had perhaps known for some time, that her invisible observation had become visible to him through some perception she could not fathom, and he had not been angry or disgusted, but instead had created this moment of acknowledgement that stopped just short of direct confrontation. She should flee, should abandon this dangerous intimacy before it destroyed them both. Yet she remained frozen at the keyhole, watching Alexander Pembroke lean his head back and close his eyes with an expression of such profound weariness, mingled with hope, that her heart ached with recognition of his loneliness matching her own. The danger had increased exponentially now that the barrier of his unknowing had been stripped away, now that this could no longer be dismissed as harmless secret observation, but had become instead a conspiracy between two souls reaching across an impossible divide, and Clara pulled away from the keyhole finally and fled down the corridor with her cleaning supplies abandoned and her entire world transformed by the terrifying knowledge that she had been seen. May 3rd, 1817. The gardens of Ashworth Manor in the afternoon held the drowsy promise of approaching rain, with grey clouds building on the horizon, and the air thick with moisture that made the scent of roses intensify until Clara could taste their sweetness on her tongue as she moved among the bushes with her cutting shears and wicker basket, selecting blooms for the arrangements Mrs. Langley had ordered for the drawing-room, where Lady Beatrice Somerset held court each day like a queen awaiting her coronation. Clara had been grateful for this outdoor assignment that removed her from the suffocating atmosphere of the house, where every corridor seemed to pulse with the memory of Alexander Pembroke's grey eyes meeting hers in the library 5 days earlier, where every moment carried the electrical charge of potential encounter, and she worked methodically among the roses, telling herself that distance and duty would restore the proper order to her disordered heart, even as she knew the lie for what it was. She was examining a particularly fine yellow bloom when his voice spoke from behind her with a warmth that made her entire body go rigid with awareness. "Those are my mother's favourites," Alexander said quietly, and Clara turned to find him standing not 10 feet distant, with his coat unbuttoned and his dark hair slightly dishevelled by the rising wind, looking nothing like a duke and everything like a man seeking refuge from the constraints of his position. She curtsied reflexively, despite her dirt-stained apron and the shears clutched awkwardly in her calloused hands. But he waved away the formality with an impatient gesture and moved closer until she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes and the tension in his jaw that spoke of sleepless nights matching her own. "Do you enjoy working with flowers, Clara?" he asked, using her Christian name with an intimacy that both thrilled and terrified her. "Or is this merely another task assigned without regard for your preferences?" She found her voice with effort and answered truthfully that she loved the gardens, that growing things represented hope and beauty emerging from darkness. And she watched his expression shift into something almost hungry, as if her words fed some starving part of him that hollow social conversations could never reach. He began speaking then about beauty in unexpected places, about how society valued only cultivated formal gardens while dismissing the wild roses that grew along country lanes, and Clara understood they were no longer discussing flowers, but something far more dangerous, some metaphorical territory where a housemaid might represent authenticity in a world of performance. The first drops of rain began to fall as he asked her about her life before service, about her family and hopes and the books she wished she could read, and Clara answered with cautious honesty while thunder rumbled closer. Then Alexander removed his coat and extended it toward her as the rain intensified, an offer she refused with quiet firmness because accepting would be witnessed and reported and weaponized against them both by eyes she could feel watching from the house windows. He respected her refusal without argument, but his gaze lingered on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. And then Mrs. Langley's voice cut through the rain, calling Clara back to her duties with an edge of suspicion that made Alexander's expression harden into ducal authority as he informed the housekeeper that he had detained Clara with questions about the garden cultivation, and she was not to be faulted for the delay, his tone brooking no contradiction, even as the older woman's shrewd eyes moved between them with calculation that promised future consequences. May 5th, 1817. Clara had sworn to herself throughout the 2 days since the rain-soaked garden encounter that she would not return to the East Wing corridor, would not kneel before the worn brass keyhole that had become both her solace and her torment. Yet as evening descended and the household settled into its familiar rhythms, she found her feet carrying her through the shadowed passages with a compulsion that overrode reason and shame and every practical consideration her desperate heart could muster. She carried no cleaning supplies tonight because pretense had become impossible, and when she reached the heavy door at 7:30, she knelt with trembling legs and pressed her eye to the keyhole with the awful recognition that she had moved beyond mere observation into something far more dangerous, something that felt less like secret watching and more like answered prayer. The scene beyond the keyhole arrested her with its familiar beauty, the copper tub filled with steaming water that caught lamplight in golden ripples, the marble floor reflecting wavering shadows, the scent of lavender drifting through the narrow opening, and Alexander Pembroke standing beside the bath removing his evening clothes with movements that seemed deliberate and conscious in a way that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. He unbuttoned his waistcoat slowly, far more slowly than she had observed in the 3 months of watching, and his expression held a quality of listening or waiting that made her pulse hammer against her ribs with the terrible suspicion that something fundamental had shifted in the nature of this ritual. Alexander folded his waistcoat with precise care and draped it over the chair, then began working the buttons of his shirt while turning slightly toward the door, not looking directly at it, but positioning himself so that his profile caught the lamplight in sharp relief. And Clara realized with shocking certainty that his movements had become performance, conscious presentation for an audience he acknowledged without naming. He removed his shirt to reveal the muscled torso she had memorized in secret, the scar on his left shoulder that she knew came from a riding accident in his youth, and then he paused and spoke aloud to the empty room in a voice that carried clearly through the keyhole. "I find these evening hours less lonely of late," he said quietly, as if musing to himself, "though perhaps I deceive myself in imagining a sympathetic presence that shares these moments of solitude." Clara's entire body went rigid with the terrible understanding that crashed over her like a wave breaking against cliffs. Because he knew, had somehow known or sensed or intuited that she watched, and rather than being disgusted or angry, he had created this moment of oblique acknowledgement that stopped just short of direct confrontation. She should flee, should abandon this impossible connection before it destroyed them both. Yet she remained frozen at the keyhole as Alexander stepped into the bath and settled back against the copper rim with water lapping at his shoulders, his eyes closing with an expression of profound weariness mingled with something that looked almost like hope. He spoke again, so quietly she had to strain to hear above the thundering of her own heart. "I confess I hope whoever shares these quiet interludes understands that connection between souls transcends the arbitrary conventions of position and propriety," he said, his voice carrying invitation and longing in equal measure, and that some presences bring comfort rather than intrusion, even when they remain unseen. Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks as she understood the gift he offered, this acknowledgement that transformed her watching from shameful secret into shared conspiracy, this permission to continue what she could not seem to stop. And in that moment, the barrier between observed and observer dissolved into something new and terrifying, a mutual recognition that pulled them both toward an inevitable confrontation neither could escape. May 6th, 1817. Clara knelt before the keyhole at 9 in the evening, with her entire body trembling so violently she could barely press her eye to the worn brass opening, because after the previous night's oblique acknowledgement, she knew with terrible certainty that continuing this ritual meant crossing a threshold from which there could be no return. Yet she found herself powerless against the magnetic pull that had drawn her through the shadowed corridors, to this spot that had become the axis around which her entire existence revolved. The bathing chamber beyond appeared empty at first, with only lamplight flickering across the marble floor and steam rising from the filled copper tub, and Clara had begun to think perhaps Alexander had abandoned their unspoken appointment when the door suddenly swung open from the inside, and she found herself staring not through the keyhole, but directly into the grey eyes of Alexander Pembroke, standing before her in a silk dressing gown, with an expression of such tender determination that her breath stopped entirely in her chest. He extended his hand toward her without speaking, and Clara remained frozen on her knees, unable to move or think or do anything but stare at him, with tears already streaming down her face, until he spoke her name with such gentleness that something broke open inside her, and words began pouring out in a desperate confession about the 3 months of watching, the shame that consumed her, the inability to stop, despite knowing the wrongness of it, the loneliness that had driven her to seek connection even through a keyhole because she had been invisible for so long that even secret observation felt like a kind of communion. Alexander listened without interrupting while she wept and confessed and apologized. Then he knelt before her on the corridor floor, so their eyes were level, and took both her hands in his with a touch so warm and solid that it anchored her spiraling panic. And he told her quietly that he had noticed her in the household 3 weeks earlier, had seen the way she moved through rooms like a ghost seeking substance, had recognized in her eyes the same desperate isolation that plagued his own privileged existence, and he had been hoping she would find the courage to stop hiding because he was tired of the barriers that separated souls who might otherwise find solace in genuine recognition. Clara began to protest that she had no right to such recognition, that she was nothing and he was everything, and the distance between them could not be bridged by wishful thinking. But Alexander rose and drew her gently to her feet and led her through the doorway into the bathing chamber she had only ever glimpsed through the keyhole, the room seeming both familiar and utterly strange now that she stood within it. And when she tried to pull away and flee, he tightened his grip on her hand and said he was tired of barriers both literal and metaphorical, tired of performing for a society that valued everything except authentic human connection. And then, before she could comprehend his intention, he pulled her forward, and they tumbled together into the warm water of the copper tub, with Clara fully clothed and gasping at the shock of it. The water closed over her worn grey dress and soaked through to her skin as Alexander held her against his chest with arms that felt impossibly strong and impossibly gentle, and Clara found herself sobbing against his shoulder while he whispered into her wet hair that she was seen, truly seen, not as a servant or an intrusion, but as a woman whose presence had brought unexpected light into the suffocating darkness of his isolated existence. And in that moment, with the warm water lapping around them and his heartbeat steady beneath her cheek, Clara understood that everything had irrevocably changed, and there would be no returning to the safe invisibility that had protected her from both hope and heartbreak. May 6th, 1817, at 10 in the evening, Clara found herself standing in Alexander Pembroke's private chambers, wearing clothing she had never imagined touching, let alone wearing. A linen shirt far too large for her frame that hung nearly to her knees, and a pair of his breeches that she had rolled multiple times at the ankles, her wet hair dripping down her back while he tended the fire with movements that seemed designed to give her time to compose herself, though composition felt utterly beyond her capacity, after the overwhelming intimacy of being held in warm water while confessing her months of secret observation. Alexander had wrapped her soaked grey dress in toweling and hung it near the fire where it steamed gently, this careful domestic attention to practical matters somehow more devastating than the grand gesture of pulling her into the bath. And when he finally turned from the flames to face her, his expression held such tender certainty that Clara felt tears threatening again, despite her desperate attempt to maintain some shred of dignity. He gestured toward the chair closest to the fire, and she sank into it gratefully because her legs had begun trembling with exhaustion and overwhelming emotion, and Alexander pulled the second chair close so they sat facing each other with perhaps 2 feet between them, a distance that felt simultaneously too close and impossibly distant after the pressing intimacy of his arms around her in the water. They looked at each other in silence for a long moment that stretched and deepened until Clara found words spilling from her without conscious intention, telling him about the loneliness that had driven her, to the keyhole, the years of being invisible in grand houses, the way his solitary evening ritual had seemed to mirror her own isolation, until she felt less alone simply by witnessing his private moments of vulnerability. Alexander listened without interrupting, his grey eyes never leaving her face, and when she finally fell silent, he spoke quietly about duty and desire, about the suffocating weight of a title he had never wanted, about performing the role of duke for a society that valued breeding and tradition over authentic human connection, about the slow death of living according to expectations that left no room for genuine feeling or spontaneous joy. He confessed he had been suffocating under obligations and empty social rituals until he noticed her 3 weeks earlier, moving through his household like a ghost seeking substance, and something in her careful, invisible presence had woken a desperate hunger for reality over performance. Clara protested that what he described was impossible, that a duke could not court a housemaid without destroying his position and reputation, but Alexander leaned forward and took both her hands in his and said with quiet intensity that he rejected that framework entirely, that he would rather live as a genuine man with limited social standing than continue existing as a hollow duke in a cage of propriety. And then he asked not whether she understood the impossibility, but whether she felt what he felt. This magnetic pull toward authentic connection that transcended every rational argument against it. Clara found herself admitting through fresh tears that she did feel it, had felt it for months, and Alexander smiled for the first time since pulling her from the corridor and declared his intention to court her properly regardless of consequence, asking formal permission to pursue what had begun in secret and confusion. And Clara felt terror and exhilaration war within her chest as she whispered yes to a future that seemed both impossible and inevitable. May 7th, 1817. At 7 in the morning, Clara slipped through the servants' entrance just as the first pale light began filtering through the kitchen windows, her body aching with exhaustion, and her mind spinning with the impossibility of everything that had transpired in Alexander's chambers, and she had barely removed her cloak when Mary Colburn appeared at her elbow with eyes wide with concern and whispered questions about where Clara had been all night, because her bed had remained empty, and the household would soon wake and notice her absence. Clara found herself unable to form coherent explanations, her thoughts still tangled in the sensation of Alexander's arms around her in the water, and his declaration of intention to court her despite every rational argument against such madness. So she simply squeezed Mary's hand and promised to explain later when she could find words adequate to the overwhelming confusion of hope and terror that consumed her entirely. The kitchen erupted into its usual morning chaos as the cook arrived and began barking orders while other servants shuffled in, rubbing sleep from their eyes. And Clara moved through her tasks with mechanical precision while her mind remained locked in the private chambers where everything had changed, until the bell rang, summoning staff to lay breakfast in the dining room, and she found herself carrying tea service into the space where Lady Beatrice Somerset sat in emerald silk, looking every inch the Duchess she clearly intended to become. Beatrice barely glanced at Clara, while complaining in a voice pitched to carry about the declining standards of service in even the finest households, making pointed comments about staff who forgot their proper place and positions, and Clara felt her face burning as she poured tea with hands that trembled slightly until Alexander entered the room and surveyed the scene with grey eyes that missed nothing of Beatrice's calculated cruelty. He interrupted Beatrice's complaints with icy politeness to defend his household staff as exemplary and beyond reproach, his tone brooking no argument, and Clara watched Beatrice's blue eyes narrow with sudden sharp suspicion as she looked between Alexander and the maid he had chosen to defend so publicly. Mrs. Langley appeared in the doorway and gestured for Clara to follow her into the corridor, and once they stood alone in the shadowed hallway, the housekeeper studied Clara's face with an expression mixing concern and warning before speaking quietly about how unnatural attention from the master brought only danger and heartbreak to servants who forgot the unbridgeable distance between their worlds. Clara wanted to protest that Alexander saw no such distance, that he had declared his intention to reject the very framework that demanded such separation. But the words died in her throat, because speaking them aloud would make real something that still felt like a fever dream born of loneliness and desperate longing. The morning continued with Clara hyper-aware of eyes watching her from every corner, Thomas Whitmore the butler observing her movements with naked suspicion, other servants whispering behind their hands, and she had begun to feel suffocated by the scrutiny when a commotion at the front entrance announced the arrival of Lord George Carstairs, Alexander's friend from university days, whose liberal politics and easy manner had made him somewhat scandalous in rigid social circles. Clara caught only a glimpse of Carstairs as Alexander greeted him warmly in the entrance hall, but something in the visitor's open, friendly countenance and the way Alexander's shoulders relaxed slightly in his presence suggested that perhaps not everyone in the Duke's world would condemn what had begun in secret the previous night, and Clara clung to that small hope even as fear whispered that the household's shifting awareness would destroy everything before it could truly begin. May 10th, 1817, at 4 in the afternoon, Lady Beatrice Somerset sat in the drawing-room of Ashworth Manor, orchestrating what she clearly intended as her triumph, having sent invitations to local gentry families for an impromptu gathering where she positioned herself at the center of the room in pale blue silk that matched her calculating eyes, holding court as though already mistress of the estate, while Alexander stood near the windows with visible discomfort, tightening the corners of his mouth. Clara moved through the assembled guests carrying trays of tea and delicate cakes, her grey dress marking her as invisible to the finely dressed ladies and gentlemen who spoke around her as though she were merely part of the furniture, and she felt the weight of every whispered conversation that followed her movements through the crowded space where tension hung thick as smoke. Beatrice had positioned herself brilliantly, discussing future improvements to the manor and planned social events in London with the assumption of authority that made several guests nod approvingly, and Clara watched Alexander's jaw clench each time Beatrice used the word "we" to describe decisions she had no right to make. The afternoon crawled forward with excruciating slowness, until Clara approached Beatrice's chair to refill her teacup, and somehow, in a movement too swift and deliberate to be truly accidental, Beatrice shifted and sent the entire cup of dark liquid cascading down the front of Clara's dress while gasping in exaggerated dismay. The room fell silent as Beatrice immediately began apologizing in a voice pitched to carry, while simultaneously suggesting that the clumsy maid had bumped her arm, that standards of service had declined shockingly, that perhaps the staff required better supervision, and Clara stood frozen with hot tea soaking through her bodice, while shame burned her cheeks and every eye in the room fixed upon her moment of humiliation. Alexander crossed the space in 3 long strides, and his voice cut through the silence with cold fury as he declared that the fault lay entirely with the guest who had moved carelessly, that his staff were beyond reproach, that Miss Thornhill in particular demonstrated grace and competence that put many of supposedly superior breeding to shame, and the use of her surname rather than simply her position sent shock rippling through the assembled company like a stone dropped in still water. Beatrice's face went white and then red as whispers erupted around the room, guests leaning toward each other behind raised fans and gloved hands, and Clara realized with sinking horror that Alexander's defense had been too passionate, too personal, that his use of her name marked her as someone he noticed in ways that transcended appropriate distance between master and servant. She fled to the kitchens where Mary found her shaking and revealed in urgent whispers that Beatrice had been spreading rumors for days about the Duke showing inappropriate attention to a certain housemaid, that the servants' quarters buzzed with speculation, that Clara's nighttime absence had been noted and discussed, and Clara felt the walls closing in as she understood that her very presence in Alexander's life was becoming the weapon his enemies would use to destroy him. Lord Carstairs appeared in the doorway and requested a private word with Alexander, and through the crack in the kitchen door, Clara watched the two men speak in low, urgent tones until Carstairs clapped Alexander on the shoulder with an expression of support that suggested he had just pledged his allegiance to whatever scandalous choice his friend intended to make. May 11th, 1817. At midnight, Clara Thornhill knelt on the cold floor of the tiny room she shared with Mary Colborne and folded her 3 worn dresses into a cloth bundle with hands that shook so violently she could barely manage the simple task, her heart breaking with each item she placed inside, because she understood with terrible clarity that her continued presence at Ashworth Manor would destroy the man she loved more certainly than any enemy could accomplish through malice or design. She had written a brief note in her awkward script explaining that she could not be the weapon used against him, that his reputation and position mattered more than her desperate longing, that loving him meant protecting him even from herself, and she left this folded paper on her pillow where Mary would find it in the morning and perhaps understand why Clara had vanished like morning mist burned away by sun. The house lay silent around her as she crept through shadowed corridors toward the kitchen entrance, carrying her meager belongings and wearing her least threadbare cloak, and the familiar spaces seemed to watch her departure with sad knowledge that some stories could not survive the cruel mathematics of class and expectation, no matter how genuine the feeling that animated them. The garden stretched before her in silver moonlight as she slipped through the kitchen door and followed the gravel path toward the estate gate, each step carrying her further from the brief, impossible happiness she had tasted in Alexander's arms when he held her in warm water and whispered that she was seen, and tears streamed down her face as she walked, because leaving felt like cutting out her own heart, but staying would destroy his future, and she loved him too much to allow that ruin. She had nearly reached the iron gate that marked the boundary between the estate and the wider world when she heard rapid footsteps behind her and turned to see Alexander running toward her in shirt-sleeves without coat or cravat, his dark hair wild and his grey eyes blazing with fury and desperate tenderness that stopped her breath in her throat. He reached her in 10 strides and grasped her shoulders with shaking hands, while demanding to know what madness possessed her to leave without word, and she tried to explain through sobs that she was saving him from scandal and social destruction, but he cut off her words by pulling her against his chest with such fierce possession that her bundle fell forgotten to the ground. Alexander spoke rapidly about how he wanted no protection that cost him the only authentic connection he had ever known, how he refused to sacrifice love for the hollow approval of people whose opinions meant nothing measured against the weight of what he felt when he looked at her. And then, in the moonlight beside the estate gate, he asked her to marry him with no ring to offer, but only the absolute certainty in his voice that made the proposal more binding than any formal ceremony. Clara protested that he was mad to throw away everything for a housemaid who brought nothing but her damaged heart and calloused hands, but Alexander insisted with passion breaking through his usual restraint that he was finally sane after years of suffocating under expectations that nearly killed the best parts of him, and he begged her not to make decisions based on fear when courage had brought them this far against impossible odds. May 11th, 1817, at 2 in the morning, Alexander Pembroke led Clara Thornhill back through the moonlit garden toward Ashworth Manor, with her hand clasped firmly in his as though he feared she might vanish like smoke if he loosened his grip, and they entered through the same kitchen door she had used for her attempted escape. But now everything had transformed because she crossed the threshold, not as a fleeing servant, but as the woman the Duke of Ashworth had just asked to marry him in words that still echoed through her mind with impossible beauty. He brought her to his private study, where a fire burned low in the grate, and the familiar scent of leather and parchment wrapped around them like an embrace, and his hands shook visibly as he poured brandy into 2 crystal glasses that caught the firelight and threw amber shadows across the mahogany desk, scattered with estate correspondence that represented the weight of responsibility he carried every moment of every day. Clara stood frozen near the door, still protesting in a voice that trembled with hope and terror that this madness would destroy him, that society would never accept a housemaid as duchess, that his family and peers would turn against him with vicious certainty. But Alexander set down the brandy decanter with deliberate care and turned to face her, with grey eyes blazing with determination that silenced her frightened words before they could fully form. He began systematically dismantling every argument she offered, like a barrister presenting an irrefutable case, speaking of his absolute authority over his own life and choices, reminding her that he held one of the oldest titles in England and commanded wealth and influence that made him answerable to no one, declaring his willingness to face whatever social consequences arose, because the alternative of living without her constituted a far worse fate than any scandal society might manufacture. Alexander crossed the space between them and took her hands in his, while asking in a voice rough with emotion what she wanted rather than what she feared, whether somewhere beneath her terror and self-sacrifice lived a desire that matched the consuming need he felt whenever he looked at her. And Clara felt something break open inside her chest as tears streamed down her face, and she admitted in a whisper that she loved him with desperate completeness, had loved him for months while watching through that keyhole and learning the contours of his loneliness that so perfectly matched her own. He pulled her against him and kissed her then with a tenderness that transformed into fierce possession, his mouth claiming hers while his hands tangled in her loose hair, and Clara kissed him back with all the longing she had suppressed during those long nights of secret observation when she had believed that touching him existed only in the realm of impossible dreams that women like her were forbidden to entertain. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he promised with absolute certainty that he would make this right, that he had already begun forming a strategy to present their union in ways that would minimize resistance, and he revealed his intention to announce their engagement at the ball planned for 4 days, hence where local society would gather and witness his public claim upon her that would make retreat impossible for either of them. Alexander moved to his desk and retrieved a small velvet box that he opened to reveal a ring set with sapphires and diamonds that had belonged to his mother, and he explained that she would need to wear it hidden until the announcement. But he wanted her to carry this physical proof of his commitment against her skin. So Clara allowed him to slip the cool metal onto a silver chain and fasten it around her neck, where the ring settled between her breasts, beneath her plain dress, like a secret flame burning against her heart. May 15th, 1817. At 7 in the evening, Clara Thornhill stood in a guest chamber at Ashworth Manor, wearing a gown of pale blue silk that Lord George Carstairs had procured from his younger sister with remarkable discretion, the fabric whispering against her skin like a foreign language she was only beginning to understand, while Mary Colburn fastened the tiny pearl buttons along her spine with trembling fingers and whispered encouragement that did little to calm the terror churning in Clara's stomach as she prepared to descend into the ballroom where Alexander would declare their engagement before the assembled local gentry who would judge her with merciless precision. The sapphire ring that had belonged to Alexander's mother now rested on her left hand rather than hidden beneath her bodice, the weight of it both comforting and terrifying as she touched it compulsively while Mary arranged her dark hair in a simple style that acknowledged Clara's lack of sophistication, while somehow transforming it into austere elegance that suited her fine features and grey eyes that had spent months watching Alexander through a keyhole before he pulled her into warm water and held her while she cried. The sounds of the ball drifted up through the floorboards, as musicians tuned instruments and guests arrived in carriages that crunched across gravel, their laughter and conversation creating a wall of noise that represented everything Clara had never been permitted to touch during her 25 years of invisible service, and she fought the desperate urge to flee back to the servants' quarters, where at least she understood the rules that governed her existence. Alexander had sent word an hour earlier that he would meet her at the top of the main staircase at precisely 7 and escort her down into the ballroom in full view of everyone gathered, and Clara descended from the guest wing on unsteady legs to find him waiting in formal evening dress, with his dark hair carefully arranged and his grey eyes blazing with determination and love that steadied her when she took his offered arm with fingers that shook despite her best efforts at composure. The ballroom blazed with candlelight from 3 crystal chandeliers that transformed the space into something magical and dangerous, the polished floor reflecting golden illumination, while guests in silk and jewels turned as one to stare at the Duke of Ashworth, entering with a housemaid on his arm, wearing borrowed finery and his mother's ring, and Clara felt the weight of their collective shock, like a physical blow that nearly stopped her breath. Lady Beatrice Somerset stood near the refreshment table in emerald silk that matched her furious eyes, her beautiful face twisted with rage and humiliation as she watched Alexander lead Clara directly to the center of the floor, where he raised his hand for silence and announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the room that he had the honor of presenting his betrothed, Miss Clara Thornhill, who had captured his heart with her genuine spirit and uncommon grace. The response came in waves, starting with gasps that rippled through the assembled guests, followed by urgent whispers and shocked exclamations as people processed the impossible declaration, and Beatrice moved with deliberate calculation to gather several prominent families who followed her lead in making for the exit with expressions of outraged propriety that declared their refusal to countenance such a scandal. Alexander stood unmoved by the exodus and began speaking again about how he had spent years suffocating under expectations that valued bloodlines and fortune over authentic human connection, how he refused to apologize for choosing love over hollow tradition, how he hoped those who truly cared for him would find the courage to support a union based on mutual respect and genuine feeling, rather than the mercenary calculations that governed most aristocratic marriages. Lord Carstairs began, applauding with slow, deliberate claps that echoed through the half-empty ballroom, and was joined gradually by his wife and several younger couples, who seemed moved by Alexander's passionate defense, while at the back of the room Clara glimpsed servants gathered in the doorways, with tears streaming down their faces, and Mrs. Harriet Langley offering the smallest nod of approval that somehow meant more than all the aristocratic acceptance in England. May 20th, 1817. At 10 in the morning, Clara Thornhill sat in a guest chamber that Alexander had transformed into her private apartments, rooms that just 5 days earlier she could not have entered except to clean, but now belonged to her with their cream silk wallpaper and mahogany furniture that gleamed with beeswax polish applied by other servants, who looked at her with expressions ranging from awed admiration to bitter resentment, depending on their individual characters, and understanding of what her elevation meant for all of them. A tutor named Miss Margaret Fairfax perched on the settee opposite Clara, attempting to teach proper posture and conversation skills required for a duchess, demonstrating how to hold a teacup with appropriate delicacy, and discussing the complex hierarchy of social calls and visiting cards that governed aristocratic life. But Clara's attention kept drifting to the window, where spring sunlight illuminated gardens she had once tended as invisible labor, and now would walk through as mistress of the estate in a transformation so complete it felt like inhabiting someone else's skin. Alexander had hired Miss Fairfax along with a French modiste named Madame Leclerc, who had arrived yesterday with trunks full of fabrics and fashion plates, measuring Clara with brisk efficiency, while explaining that a duchess required wardrobes for morning, afternoon, evening, and formal occasions that would take weeks to complete, but Alexander had ordered everything expedited with the power of unlimited funds and ducal authority that could accomplish impossibilities through sheer force of will. The social consequences of the ball continued rippling outward, in ways both painful and surprisingly hopeful, as some prominent families had indeed severed connections by returning invitations unopened and spreading vicious gossip about the Duke of Ashworth's madness in elevating a housemaid. But other families, particularly those with younger, more liberal-minded members, had sent cautious notes of congratulation that suggested curiosity might overcome prejudice given time, and Alexander's unwavering commitment to his scandalous choice. Lord George Carstairs had become an invaluable ally, visiting daily to offer support and coach Clara in navigating social complexities, explaining with patient kindness that half the aristocracy secretly despised the rigid hierarchies they publicly defended and would welcome any crack in the facade that allowed authentic feeling to emerge from beneath performative propriety. Mary. Colburn had been elevated to lady's maid over the protests of butler Thomas Whitmore, who had grown increasingly hostile as his familiar world order collapsed, and Mary's presence provided Clara with desperately needed friendship as she navigated chambers that still felt foreign, despite the luxury surrounding her on every polished surface and silk cushion. Mrs. Harriet Langley had surprised everyone by requesting a private audience with Clara to offer somewhat stiff congratulations and practical advice about managing household staff from a position of authority rather than servitude, explaining that Clara's unprecedented rise would be judged harshly by society, but could inspire hope in every servant who had ever believed their station fixed and immutable by birth. Alexander spent hours each day with Clara, teaching her estate management and introducing her to tenants and staff in ways that demonstrated his absolute confidence in her capability. And at night, he would find her in her chambers to hold her while she cried from overwhelming pressure and kiss away her fears, with tender assurances that she was not alone in this transformation that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure as the wedding date approached with inexorable certainty. May 25th, 1817, at 3 in the afternoon, Clara Thornhill walked through the East Wing corridor where just 6 weeks earlier she had knelt before a keyhole watching Alexander Pembroke bathe in candlelit solitude. But now she moved as his acknowledged betrothed, wearing a dove-grey walking dress that Madame Leclerc had finished yesterday with pearl buttons that gleamed against the fine wool fabric, while Clara tried to inhabit this new identity that felt simultaneously natural and impossible, depending on the moment, and her fluctuating confidence in the extraordinary transformation that had lifted her from invisible servitude to Duchess-in-waiting. The wedding was set for June 12th, just 18 days away, and Alexander had insisted on a full ceremony in the village church rather than a discreet, private affair, because he refused to treat their union as something shameful to be hidden from scrutiny, though his determination to celebrate publicly meant enduring the stares and whispers of villagers who had never noticed Clara during her 7 years of service at the manor, but now watched her every movement with fascination or disapproval depending on their individual capacity for accepting impossible social mobility. She paused outside the bathroom where Alexander had pulled her into warm water while she cried and confessed months of watching through the keyhole, that pivotal moment when he had whispered that she was seen and destroyed the barriers between their separate worlds with the revolutionary act of acknowledging her full humanity, despite the servant livery she had worn like invisible armor against hope. The door stood open now, revealing marble floors and the copper bathtub that had witnessed her transformation, and Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the memory of his tenderness when she had expected judgment, his certainty when she had offered only fear, his insistence that authentic connection mattered more than all the rigid hierarchies that governed their world with merciless precision. Alexander found her standing there, lost in memory, and wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder while they both gazed at the room that held such significance in their unconventional courtship. And he asked quietly if she regretted the chaos their love had created in the previously ordered universe of Ashworth Manor. Clara turned in his embrace to face him directly, touching his jaw with fingers that no longer bore the calluses of scrubbing floors, but still remembered the weight of servitude that had defined her entire existence before he decided she deserved to be lifted into visibility. And she told him with absolute honesty that she regretted nothing except the years they had spent in the same house as strangers, separated by artificial boundaries that declared her unworthy of his notice. He kissed her then with the passion that still surprised her, despite their growing intimacy, his hands cradling her face while she gripped his shoulders and felt the solid reality of him anchoring her against the disorienting swirl of change that threatened to overwhelm her fragile confidence in her right to occupy space beside him as an equal partner rather than invisible labor. A discreet cough interrupted them, and they separated to find Lord George Carstairs standing in the corridor with an amused expression and news that several more families had sent acceptances for the wedding, including the Earl of Langdon, who was known for progressive politics and whose attendance would lend considerable legitimacy to the scandalous union that society was still processing, with mixed reactions ranging from outrage to cautious approval. June 10th, 1817, at 11 in the morning, just 2 days before the wedding. Clara Thornhill stood in the private chapel at Ashworth Manor while Reverend Edmund Blake conducted the final rehearsal of the ceremony that would bind her to Alexander Pembroke in matrimony that defied every social convention governing their stratified world, and the elderly clergyman had initially resisted performing the service until Alexander made a substantial donation to the village church and spoke passionately about the hypocrisy of Christian teachings that preached equality before God, while maintaining rigid earthly hierarchies that declared some souls more valuable than others based solely on accidents of birth. Mary Colburn sat in the front pew wearing a new blue dress that Clara had commissioned for her because Mary would stand as witness, along with Lord George Carstairs, the small wedding party reflecting Alexander's decision to keep the ceremony intimate, rather than subjecting Clara to the scrutiny of a large gathering filled with aristocrats who would attend only to judge and gossip about the scandalous mismatch between Duke and former housemaid. Lady Beatrice Somerset had departed Ashworth Manor the day after the ball in a fury of wounded pride and venomous pronouncements about Alexander's madness, and rumour suggested she had returned to London society, spreading tales designed to damage his reputation. Though Alexander seemed entirely unconcerned with her malicious efforts to poison opinion against him among families whose approval he had never valued, even when he moved through their world as an eligible bachelor, meeting their expectations. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of preparation and adjustment as Clara learned to navigate her new position with help from Miss Margaret Fairfax, whose etiquette lessons gradually shifted from formal instruction to genuine friendship. When the tutor recognized Clara's quick intelligence and natural dignity that no amount of fine clothing could create if the character beneath lacked substance worth cultivating. Madame Leclerc had completed an entire wardrobe, including the wedding gown that hung in Clara's chambers, a creation of ivory silk and delicate lace that felt impossibly luxurious against skin that still remembered the rough texture of servant uniforms and the ache of labor that had defined her existence for 7 years before Alexander decided she deserved visibility. Mrs. Harriet Langley had become an unexpected source of support, offering practical advice about household management and privately confessing that she had entered service at 14 years old and spent 40 years working her way to housekeeper. So Clara's unprecedented elevation felt like vindication of every servant who had been told their worth was fixed and immutable, regardless of capability or character. Thomas Whitmore remained coldly disapproving, but had been forced to accept the new order or seek employment elsewhere, and several other staff members who could not reconcile themselves to serving a former peer had indeed left the estate to be replaced by new servants carefully selected for open-minded attitudes and loyalty to Alexander rather than rigid adherence to traditional hierarchies. Alexander watched Clara practice her vows with an expression of such profound tenderness that she felt tears threaten despite her determination to maintain composure during the rehearsal. And when Reverend Blake instructed them to practice the kiss that would seal their union, Alexander pulled her close and whispered against her lips that in 2 days she would be his duchess, and he would spend the rest of his life ensuring she never regretted the courage it took to believe impossible love could become solid reality. June 12, 1817, at 3 in the afternoon. Clara Thornhill, who had been born to a tenant farmer and entered service at 18 years old with calloused hands and no prospects beyond a lifetime of invisible labor, stood in the vestibule of St. Mary's Church in the village of Ashworth wearing an ivory, silk gown that Madame Leclerc had sewn with such exquisite care that Clara felt transformed into someone she barely recognized when she glimpsed her reflection in the looking-glass that morning, though Alexander had insisted when he saw her that she looked exactly as she always had, beneath the fine clothing, beautiful and dignified, and entirely herself, despite the trappings of wealth that now adorned her frame. Mary Colburn stood beside her holding a bouquet of white roses from the manor garden, where Clara had once knelt in the dirt, cutting flowers for arrangements she would never be permitted to enjoy. And Mary's eyes were bright with tears of joy, because she had witnessed the entire impossible journey from keyhole observation to this moment when Clara would walk down the aisle to marry a duke who had looked past every social barrier to see the woman hidden beneath servant livery and years of forced invisibility. The church bells rang out across the village, calling witnesses to the scandalous ceremony, and Clara could hear the murmur of voices from inside the sanctuary, where approximately 50 guests had gathered, including Lord George Carstairs and the Earl of Langdon, and several other progressive aristocrats who had decided that Alexander Pembroke's radical choice to marry for authentic love rather than suitable breeding deserved support, despite the uncomfortable questions it raised about the arbitrary nature of social hierarchies that governed their world with merciless precision. Mrs. Harriet Langley appeared in the vestibule wearing her best black dress with a cameo brooch at her throat, and she approached Clara with an expression that mixed approval and emotion as she adjusted the delicate lace veil that framed Clara's face and whispered that in 40 years of service she had never witnessed anything as brave or as right as what was about to occur in this church that preached equality before God, while its congregation practiced rigid earthly stratification. The organ music began to swell with the opening notes of the processional hymn, and Clara felt her hands tremble around the rose bouquet as Mary squeezed her arm and murmured encouragement, while the vestibule door opened to reveal the church interior with its stone columns and stained glass windows that cast colored light across the assembled witnesses, who turned as one to watch Clara's entrance. Alexander stood at the altar beside Reverend Edmund Blake, wearing formal attire with his dark hair swept back from his face, and when his eyes found Clara in the doorway, his expression transformed into such profound joy and certainty that her trembling ceased and her fear dissolved, because she knew with absolute conviction that this man who had pulled her from invisible servitude into full visibility would honor and cherish her regardless of what challenges their unconventional union would face in the years ahead. Clara took her first step down the aisle without a father to escort her, because she walked toward Alexander as herself rather than as property being transferred between men, and with each step she felt the weight of her past life as a housemaid falling away to be replaced by the extraordinary present reality, where she moved through space as a woman choosing love over safety and authentic connection over the bitter security of accepted limitations.